Good morning and welcome to Mountain Standard Time. I'm your host, Nathan Giede, and today I'll be speaking with Sam Cooper, the author of Wilful Blindness and an investigative journalist who's going to explain to us in no uncertain terms what's gone on in China infiltrating the West with its money, its power, its influence, and its chicanery. Before we get into that, I just want to remind everyone that there is, of course, Resistance Coffee. They are a sponsor of our show. Resistance Coffee Company is based out of Weyburn, Saskatchewan. And whereas many other coffee companies and companies in general will use a portion of their profits to support all sorts of causes that curtail your freedoms, that is not the case with Resistance Coffee. You can order them online and you use our promo code The Western Standard for 10% off your first order. And they promise that they don't use a single cent to curtail freedom. In fact, they help support those who fight for our freedoms, both at the constitutional level as well as locally here at home and abroad. Well, we're going to go straight into our opening statement here. And we've got to remember a few things when it comes to dealing with China. We must understand that a very short time ago, the center of the earth on all maps was, when they were made in Christendom anyways, was Jerusalem. And everything east of Jerusalem was called the Orient. And that's how, in a sense, we started calling the far east of Asia the Orient, especially past the Middle East. And it's interesting because that suited the people who lived there just fine, because as far as the ruling class of China was concerned for the last, several thousand years, until basically the modern era, they were rulers of all of earth and of all under heaven. China's dominance was asymmetrical to the West for many years. It dates all the way back to Roman times. They really liked exchanging cash for goods. So they would give you a good and you would give them cash. And they weren't really interested in any of the goods you were selling. So the Europeans, of course, were not happy about this when they started their exploration. And they started a few skirmishes for Macau and Hong Kong. That, of course, would have been the British. There were other skirmishes as well. But finally, of course, there was the opiate crisis in the reverse direction. So we have to remember this is the second opiate crisis. The original opiate crisis, they used opium to break into China's social structure. The Europeans did, and the Chinese government took exception to this, but it kind of capitulated until basically Mao arrived. Finally, what we're seeing today is kind of both a vengeance, some natural ambition, as well as a reordering of things back to the axis that was always there, that China is kind of on top and everybody else is below. That doesn't make that a good thing. And perhaps there is a way to live better with this new behemoth that we call the Chinese Communist Party and the near continent-sized country that they rule. But the point is that we're in the midst of all these things, and it isn't a new thing. There's a lot of historical undercurrents, and there's a lot of chicanery going on when it comes to the new world. So we will now turn to our guest for more information. Let's hope that we can make it out of this mess. I have Sam Cooper on the line with me via phone, so you'll be listening to his audio. Sam Cooper, welcome to the program.
Thanks very much for having me.
All right, well, let's start from the top. What inspired you to write Wilful Blindness? What tipped you off? What was the investigative moment that kind of told you, hey, you know what, this needs to be investigated?
I would say that the trigger moment really fit very well with the introduction you just gave, that this really is a very historical arc, geopolitical story. It's all about international trade. In some ways, it's about how international trade intertwines with state competition for supremacy, hegemony, and I guess I can get back to that thought about what my sources do see as an opium war in reverse, or China perhaps learning the lessons of the British Empire and now thinking that the shoe could be on the other foot, and fair play is returning the favor and sending fentanyl west. In the worst case, I do know of some very smart analysts that boil it down to that kind of conclusion. What triggered me was, I explain in Wilful Blindness that this book was really, in some ways, a retrospective of the major themes that I jumped onto as, an analytical reporter coming from a history, philosophy, English background, wanting to be a law school student, but getting into writing and journalism instead, but having that mindset that you look for big patterns, you look at the history, and you try to see the big picture while you looking at what's in front of your face. So as a student in Vancouver, I recognized what was going on in the downtown east side, this open air drug market with thousands of addicts, unreal death totals was just hard to understand in Canada. And then I started to look at real estate prices in Vancouver, also hard to understand. There was an undercurrent where anyone close to the story or inside the industry knew that offshore wealth from Hong Kong and China was a major factor in prices, but it was very, for some people, they wouldn't accept that. It was hard to get data. Eventually, my method was focusing on the major developers, the major new sort of landowners in the city, and these would be people that I found were, you couldn't understand how they exported their wealth into Vancouver, but it was happening in floods. And these players, I found, some were corruption suspects or economic fugitives. Some I eventually learned were very connected to casino money laundering and what I learned to be underground banking. It came to be known as the Vancouver model. And essentially that is, as you said in your intro, sort of an ancient system of exchange where money doesn't pass borders through the, at least on government radar, but you have underground banks, which are often connected through family members. And in fact, in the Chinese system, deep, we'll just call them criminal banks with links to almost ancient triad societies that are very based on this same opium wealth that you talked about, going back to the Opium Wars and trade. So what triggered me was when I understood the casino story in British Columbia, I got a lot more visibility on the major gamblers. That would be the whale baccarat players who traveled from China, and were funded by drug dealing loan sharks in Richmond, paid back their loans in China to facilitate more drug exports coming into Canada's West Coast. And I found that these baccarat players, essentially were some of them very connected to the Chinese state and military. I later found in my book that these would be people associated with Chinese intelligence or People's Liberation Army influence networks in Canada. And so when I found some of these people connected to these massive illegal casino mansions in British Columbia, I had the evidence of major caches of restricted or prohibited weapons in a compound, connections to the Chinese military. That's when I said, this is blowing my mind. As a pretty well-educated Canadian, I had no idea of this. It must be the case that 99.9% of Canadians could have no idea. Therefore, they have to know the threat, and I'm sure they'll be interested. And so that's what put me on the journey 3 years ago to write this book.
And I mean, it's definitely been received with great interest in a few quarters. I'm sure it's also garnered concern or even anger in some other quarters. Have you had to go into hiding? Have you kind of had to keep an eye on your shoulder and see what's coming up next?
I haven't had to go into hiding at all. There were times when, I had some concerns when I was writing from Vancouver, right in the middle of what I learned was a central espionage hub and central transnational criminal hub with connections to China's ambitions. So that at times did make me a little nervous. I moved to Ottawa, where I, just put it this way, have good sources within military and intelligence and law enforcement. And I don't have any concerns except for what is known as lawfare, and that is a Chinese government strategy to suppress or silence critical reporting of issues such as the genocide in Xinjiang, or how the Chinese state is involved in transnational money laundering with gangsters and uses gangsters to threaten and intimidate members of diaspora in Canada that the Chinese government sees as quote unquote overseas Chinese and tries to leverage as to make people that in many cases escaped an authoritarian regime. China is trying to reach in and interfere in Canada and really all Western democracies and try to make people just based on their ethnicity believe that they owe some allegiance to Xi Jinping. So do I have concerns in pointing out these uncomfortable truths? only on the legal side. I don't want to be blocked up by, a Chinese state operation to stop this reporting. And so part of my message is to Canadian readers, listeners, even people in government and media, to recognize when some of these counter messages try to muddy the waters, to recognize that there are some very nefarious actors behind that disinformation. And this is not my opinion. This is coming from intelligence reports and experts that I have access to.
So let's walk through this a little bit. It's interesting. On this show, we've talked a lot about the affordability crisis. We've talked a lot about the opiate crisis that we're facing throughout North America and indeed the rest of the West, at least in certain quarters, but certainly here in British Columbia, as we watch housing climb into astronomical rates for things that even the most ambitious realtor knows are completely ridiculous prices. And simultaneously, we're seeing all sorts of calls for safe injection sites. Other people are not happy with that. But in general, the point is that clearly there's something wrong with the supply and people are dying. All that evidence is there. Why is no one in leadership talking about the malfeasance of China? Why won't they face facts when it comes to what's going on from the Chinese mainland?
I think there's two major factors. One would be fear. For our political representatives and really business leaders, they see what has happened to Australia, who has really, out of necessity, taken the lead in the West and even perhaps the Five Eyes in strong countermeasures against China's infiltration. And as we know, the response is a type of asymmetrical or even some would say hybrid warfare response, where Australia will be the focus of massive and broad cyber attacks from China when Australia goes public and responds to China's aggression. Australia's political system will be attacked with United Front activity. And of course, for the business and trade lobby, they don't like to see when whole subsets of Australia's economy face massive sanctions, such as wine or grains. So that would be a major factor that stops Canada from doing something like saying, let's put this in the opium war context. And what if leaders in the West said, actually, we won't let any more ships come into harbor unless they're fully searched top to bottom, out at sea. Or what if we find a ship that comes in with, let's say, 100 kilograms of fentanyl precursors and dumps that safely somewhere? That would be seen by China as a warlike response. Some would say that's the position we're in. You would need those kind of sort of powerful countermeasures, that being sanctions against Chinese trade or massive searches of ships coming in, to counter this warlike death total of opium overdoses. And it's a difficult thing to do. The second factor would be that my sources would say elite capture, that is some very well-connected and powerful members of sort of business and political elites, especially in Ottawa and Montreal, have been captured through trade relationships, through private business arrangements between rich people in Montreal and Ottawa and rich people in Beijing. And that would be a form of corruption that some would say is inhibiting Canadian governments from taking, a very strong response to, I think, what's becoming clear in terms of China's nefarious intents in some areas in Canada.
It's interesting because China being on the radar of the common man, the average voter, a Joe citizen walking down the street, is actually, and perhaps it's not something anybody wants to hear or say, depending on their proclivities or how much they like or dislike the former president. But really, in a sense, it was Trump's rhetoric coming out of the 2015 nomination into 2016 in the campaign, and then his successful election to the White House. He was the one who kept saying that China, China, China. It was, we need to do something about China. And until then, most political leaders were not saying anything. And since then, it does seem that some citizens, some people at the civil level might say something, but still leadership is almost completely silent on the nefarious activities of China. For if nothing else, was Trump's influence positive in that way, or it didn't change nothing?
It's a super interesting question. I would agree that Trump's rhetoric moved the dial in some ways. But really, the reality is that Trump's rhetoric was only sort of publicizing what had already been the position of the national security community in the United States, the political community, maybe more so, well, the military certainly, but it really was a bipartisan issue in the United States. That's not to say there's huge capture in U.S. politics the same way there is in Canadian politics from Chinese interference through business elites. But there was a bipartisan understanding even before Trump started banging the table on China in a more, and this makes sense, in a more diplomatic and perhaps a bit more intelligent way. Obama was making the same points, but behind closed doors. Certainly, Obama didn't take the strong countermeasures and the banging of the table that Trump did. He was going in that direction, maybe too slowly. But yes, Trump did move the dial. Some would argue that his rhetoric really, for a while, put the American society on it, at least half of it, on its back foot, because they say this is coming from Trump. It can't be true. So now that we have President Biden clearly moving in the same direction, really, let's understand this. This is, if you want to use the word deep state or simply, institutional movement in the United States, was already moving away from China and realizing that the strategy of the past 30 years, that the West will engage China in trade and moderate China to be more like the West, open and free and living by the rule of law. The opposite happened, unfortunately. China has moderated the West to a position where people look at the response to the pandemic and think maybe we need to be much more authoritarian, because China has seemed to come out of this disaster, in some ways in a better shape. But in a Canadian context, I would say that certainly some people were listening to Trump, but I think more important in Canada was the hostage taking of the two Michaels in response to the Meng Wanzhou arrest. I believe that if you want to say that the common woman and man looked at that, and suddenly it became very clear that here's a state that has no compunction with any activity, really, if they don't get their way, or if they think that Canada does something that they don't like. And, once that happens, then people, perhaps it's very interesting. Now we have, more reporting on the genocide in Xinjiang. What if people started to pay attention to the reality that organ harvesting of minorities and religious groups in China is real? This is not, some Falun Gong poster. So I do think that popular understanding of the true nature of the Chinese state has moved way beyond in Canada to a political response that you might expect with that level of popular understanding.
And to that end, we have that popular understanding, but if at least some of America's elites, as much as many of them are still happy to make money in China and through their dealings with China, I mean, the Biden administration being no exception, obviously his son very closely tied to certain elements of the Chinese money system and how it moves around the world. But nonetheless, outside of that, if at least the United States is slumbering towards a kind of reconciliation there and to finally kind of assert itself, it seems like Canada is nowhere near it. Economic nationalism in Canada has just not been a key plank of any party for a long time. Even the Harper Conservatives didn't do a good job of articulating it. And again, there doesn't seem to be this strong rhetoric in Canada anywhere, in any leadership, about we must do something about China. I think there's been an allusion to it, from Aaron O'Toole once or twice. Before that, again, Harper was strong against Putin, but he made several trips to China. Where is that ardor in the Canadian political sphere, or are all of our politicians bullied or bought into basically the Beijing realm of influence?
In the United States, the interesting fact here is that members of what we'll call the pro-Huawei or pro-Beijing political and business elite in Eastern Canada openly were saying and messaging that we're waiting for President Trump to lose, we're waiting for Biden to come in, and at that point we hope or even believe that the U.S. will soften its stance on barring Huawei or Chinese tech companies, which anyone that's watching closely knows are military and intelligence linked. That's the Western intelligence. The opposite happened. Biden kept going in the same direction, and just last week took further measures that any Chinese military linked companies, U.S. investors will be barred from dealing with them. So the state in the United States has moved to, as you say, economic naturalism or national security has come to the forefront, where there's a realization that supply chains need to be based in North America. Nothing has made that more clear than the pandemic and PPE drainage that went to China. Your point about where's that rhetoric or even that high level strategic thinking in Canada, I do think you're right that Canadian leaders that have tried to put out that message so far have not seen it get any traction. Too easily, it's rejected as somehow populist or somehow, discordant with political attitudes in Canada. And it's difficult to understand because maybe what you mentioned about the Canadian common voter starting to understand the nature of the Chinese state and its plans for Canada, it hasn't yet moved to that more strategic level of thinking where if you have those thoughts, you need to start to consider that, Canada needs to start looking at the Arctic. Canada needs to secure its resources, rare earths. Canada needs to produce its own PPE should there be another disaster. And it'll be interesting with the coming federal election if that sort of strategic thinking and message makes it to the top, or how these campaigns go. It might get rolled out in week one and then get consumed by some distraction about culture wars and never come up again. So I'll be interested to watch that.
I'll be interested to watch that as well. Again, just for our listenership and our viewers, we're speaking with Sam Cooper, author of Wilful Blindness, How a Network of Narcos, Tycoons, and CCP Agents Infiltrated the West. For those who are viewing, here it is. And that's the cover of the book. Do purchase it where you can get it. The question becomes, in my mind, though, if Canada can't articulate a non-Chinese orientation and think about itself, hey, we could try and do something without the CPP, CCP, deciding which way we're going to vote on this, or influencing our elections, or influencing our resources, and sowing division inside of our political sphere. If that rhetoric doesn't come to the fore, Sam, it does seem in many respects like Canada, the complaint was always we were a vassal state of the Americans. That was the complaint of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Now, ever since the Cold War ended, there's kind of a more even footing through the free trade system, though I have my own complaints about that. But now into the 21st century, it's very clear Canada is beholden to the Communist Party in China and what it can do to us economically very quickly if we don't do exactly what they say with our coal shipments and with our allowing them to buy into real estate. Is there a path out? What would that look like if our political leaders actually grew a backbone on this issue?
First of all, I totally agree with your historical analysis that if you want to call it the Laurentian elite, this described group of business leaders, politicians, and lawyers, in Ottawa and Montreal and Quebec City, there was, a movement around Trudeau Senior that the United States has much to say in Canadian affairs. Canada should start to grow a backbone and assert its own way in the world. As naive as that may have been, with the understanding that North America militarily can't be separated, there was sort of an intellectual or business movement that by trading with China, we get some leverage. I'm using we, thinking, their voice, and Canada grows into a full-grown nation and can ask for more at the table at these international meetings. But as we've said, or as I said, the opposite of what was hoped, it was happening in Washington too, of course, even with Nixon and Kissinger. What was hoped, the engagement of China would make them more democratic. The opposite has happened, and the West has had to swing and realize that our principal foundations, our freedoms, are being used against us geopolitically by a state that won't budge, because if you think about it, the Chinese Communist Party cannot budge at all, because its survival depends on the most extreme form of authoritarianism. So it's not going to happen. What was hoped with Trudeau Sr. And yes, what would it look like for Canada to realize that was wrong? It's failed. I do think there's an understanding in Ottawa that a pivot, if not underway, has to occur. And really, the only way that it could occur is first realizing that, as much as you'd have to admit that United States is the leader of the free world, Australia has already recognized that their security and freedom and sovereignty depends on that sort of compact. And Canada would have to move in the same direction and say, if we have to rely less on trade with China, if this direction we've been going is the wrong one, simply it means building up more trade, increasing trade with people of a like mind in Europe and Australia, New Zealand, that are going in the direction of forming even deeper and stronger trade and military alliances, and just realizing it. In some ways, it is a zero-sum game, because in China's mind, it's a zero-sum game. You're either with them or against them, and Canada would have to actively decide, well, it's going to have to be against, and that means building up and going in the same direction that Australia has already started leading.
Yes. It's always kind of bizarre. It seems like we're always in Orwell's brain at some point during the day, depending on who's talking or what's being preached from various pulpits. But I guess it is Oceania for the win, hopefully, here against the Far East, perhaps. Nonetheless, I think in this moment, it's something that we need to talk about. Then is the pandemic and what happened with the virus and everything that ensued. You come into 2019, end of 2019, beginning of 2020, the American economy is soaring in ways it hasn't since basically the 1960s, certainly the Reagan Revolution of the 80s. You have record low unemployment. You have people seriously wondering how President Trump could ever be knocked off his re-election bid. His poll numbers were strong. The Democratic contenders look completely disorganized. And finally, of course, the world in general, things finally look like they might be looking up since 2008, since the Great Crash and the Great Recession. Suddenly a virus appears and it infiltrates everything. It scares people to no end. It shuts down economies. It causes entire changes in lifestyle in a matter of seconds, in a way that even the great wars didn't. What happened here? Without trying to impute even motive necessarily, or to theorize in any kind of conspiratorial way, though I give you free rein to say whatever you need to say there, Sam, what happened, and how did all of that strategy come together, and how did China benefit from what was either a very well placed mistake, or whatever did happen? They definitely knew how to move faster than we did and take advantage of the situation better than we did.
Right. Without looking at any questions about origins, it is clear. What do we have here? It's undisputed, based on the evidence now, that the virus was moving in Wuhan in southern China much earlier than China admitted. We know that Western nations Trump's nation included, were suckered. There were people in intelligence that were warning, you need to be ready, something big is coming. And I'm sure it's not easy to move fast and move first, but the West was too trusting of what the party was saying in Beijing. And so we know that the virus was out and moving months earlier than China would admit it. We know that China gathered PPE around the world, using its network around the world. Panic buying ensued. The West again was on its back foot, even agreeing in Canada and the United States to send massive, warehouse level shipments of PPE to China. All the while, China having the asymmetric information advantage that something very serious is spreading worldwide. We know that open source research, we can see clearly that China was not restricting flights out of its borders, and yet it was restricting flights within China and acting to contain the virus. So that raises a lot of concerns of what's known at high levels in China's government, and why did they not share that information with their Western counterparts. Moving to the lab or the wet market, certainly, as you know, and as your listeners and viewers know, the debate has moved because what was said in intelligence circles, probably from very near the start, that there could be a strong possibility this is a lab accident in Wuhan, is now becoming a more publicly acceptable idea that, for good public health reasons, was somewhat discouraged for a long time in Western media, but now it's okay to say that whether 50-50 chance or not, there need to be very serious investigations into what happened in Wuhan, because there's no denying that China has covered up, has not shared its information on viral samples. And every day when you watch in certain quarters online, scientists are turning up more evidence that it looks more and more plausible that it could have been a lab accident. And so I guess the question is, if it was a lab accident, then what kind of high level scenario modeling and, if you will, war game type thinking happens in Beijing if they knew that something accidental had happened, how they're going to respond politically and in international information flow, what happened in China, and what impact did that have on how the pandemic spread around the world. I guess we'd be remiss if we didn't say, more concerning information is coming out of this Winnipeg lab investigation scenario, where we have a researcher who was fired finally and clearly very linked to Chinese military scientists for years. Clearly, there's no denying the evidence. Her own, Dr. Chu's own records say, I have these records, the redacted ones. Every time she rationalizes to her bosses in Canada, public health, that I need to go over to China or the Wuhan lab, she's saying I'm there to help them build their capacity around handling dangerous pathogens. And furthermore, she says it's important for me to study potential bioterror sort of scenarios. So when you put that together with my knowledge of open source records that show that Dr. Chu co-researched with high-level Chinese army scientists that are flagged for the areas they work in, and the institutes in northern China they work in are the highest risk on CSIS and sort of CIA, Australian intelligence lists and databases, that all looks like a potential espionage situation in Winnipeg. And so, of course, as the plausibility of a Wuhan lab leak scenario rises, then you have to look at Winnipeg and Canada's involvement with co-research in China as well.
And this is where things really do get kind of, well, I mean, they're scary to begin with. I mean, nobody likes seeing housing prices skyrocket. Nobody likes seeing the opium deaths increase in Canada and the opiate crisis go on. But where this gets kind of into the realm of not conspiracy, but like conspiratorial behavior, or a calumny, I guess is the word I'm looking for, is that indeed, we trust our experts for a reason, and we understand that our experts, particularly in science, go and work in labs all over the world, but they share research, they spend time with one another. We give them this allotment because we fundamentally believe that they are past politics, past partisanship, and past, even in a sense, fundamental loyalty to any kind of agenda that might be wrong for the average person. That these people are here to just do the research. They're just here to do the math. They're not interested in any kind of overt political activity. They just want to help increase knowledge on some subject. And when you find out that some of these people are actually, actors and state apparatchiks, indeed, deeply involved in intelligence operations, one has to sit there and wonder, where does it stop? Where does it end? We talked about a travel ban for lots of other things. Maybe we need to tell our own university professors to come home and not practice in other labs around the world, and tell other people who are practicing in labs here, I'm sorry, but you're being sent home. Your visa's revoked.
This is what you've said raises the thought in my mind that if we look at it broadly, this question falls into the whole terms of engagement of the West with China was based on this idea that our concepts like democracy, freedom of religion, freedom of expression, academic freedom would in some way be reciprocated, all the while, and I say this not as my opinion, but direct quotes from people I've interviewed, such as former CSIS director Ward Elcock, China has a mass collection vacuum strategy and has for decades, where that doesn't mean that every scientist that travels from China into Canada will be used or will be an actor in China's scheme. What it means with China's sort of military civilian fusion concept is anyone could be directed from China or pressured in Canada, and it'll be up to that individual to sort of run from that system where they're asked to collect from China. So it's a position where Western academics will say, well, I have academic freedom, and this is about sharing for a vaccine to protect all of humankind, this kind of research. And I do think we're in the position where it's not what I think, it's what my conversations with intelligence, experts or people that are actually inside intelligence say. They have to tell people in Canadian universities, you can talk about academic freedom, but if you're on the other end of sharing something that comes back to harm your society, maybe even your family, how are you going to feel about that? Maybe you need to change or shift your understanding of what academic freedom means if the people you're working with are coming from a whole different mindset, which is collection to benefit the Chinese People's Liberation Army. And that, this comes from documents. This is not guessing at what China's up to. This is what they're up to.
I think that something that needs to be clarified here as well is that when it comes to this question of what happened out of Wuhan, and when it comes to the question of what happened through what we're calling the pandemic, one of the things that became very clear is that authoritarian measures could come into play in the West very quickly. And while we weren't prepared at the beginning, we eventually, whatever we caught up with in the end, we've seen people prosecuted, jailed. We've seen freedom of speech curtailed. We've seen liberties eliminated or drastically reduced, and kind of a total word salad come out of leadership everywhere, expert or not. Whether we're talking about provincial health officers, premiers, prime ministers, national health officers. Of course, we know that out of the World Health Organization, they were shilling for the Communist Party of China at the beginning. They're shilling for them now. They're still covering for what happened and how much the Chinese government knew as the pandemic began. It all creates a great amount of doubt in the system, but there seems to be an irony there, because whether you want to believe what the Communist Party was doing or not, they got what they wanted in the end. There couldn't be probably more division in the West and more mistrust between Joe Citizen and the experts that he has supposedly elected to rule him, or have been selected by the elected to rule, there couldn't be more division. Do you think China gained out of this situation, wherever the virus came from, that they definitely made large gains here?
It's a fluid situation, geopolitics, but clearly what occurred, even if this is a natural accident, even if it was purely, let's assume even at high levels in China's government, everything was accidental in the first few months. There was nothing intentional even in covering this up, which, let's be clear, that's not the case. The evidence is very clear. This was covered up. So as the pandemic moves across the world, it is clear that China, Russia as well, we know that Iran was in the mix, start to move into disinformation operations. And obviously they are trying to gain, because people, this language of the West versus China, Russia, Iran may seem jarring, may seem like Cold War language, but CSIS's current director has come out and said, we haven't seen espionage-like activity, cyber attacks, disinformation, like we've seen in Canada since the Cold War. So make no mistake, there's something like an asymmetrical sort of hybrid geopolitical conflict going on. It's not kinetic war, but China has sought to gain. And what's the factoid here? Look, the FBI came out last summer and said that China has used transnational cyber hackers and gangs to hack into Western institutions doing coronavirus vaccine research. So there's your unrefutable point. Whatever happened, accidental or not, China was seeking to gain the West, as the West scrambled for a vaccine to protect, China was seeking to steal that information.
No, it kind of sounds like, in a sense, there's almost a very Machiavellian genius level strategy at work inside of the CCP, where they really do try to get you coming or going, and there isn't really there isn't anything that's going to stop their thoughts on this. Let's pivot a little bit here into the treatment of their own population, let alone how they shut down Wuhan, letting flights continue out of Wuhan to the rest of the world, but they shut it down within China. That became very clear. That was known from day one, but nobody reported on it. And the other thing that kind of comes to mind is, again, the Uyghur genocide and the organs being harvested, and all the rest of it in the way that they're subjugating their own population, the attacks on Hong Kong, and trying to essentially force Hong Kong into the same system as the rest of China, which was kind of the only bastion of kind of a quasi-democracy inside of China. The brutality of the regime is kind of a thing to behold. It's something that I think even the tyrants of the 20th century, bloodthirsty as they were, and covered in the evil deeds that they committed, that even they might be shocked or ashamed of the flagrant disregard for human life that seems to come out of the Chinese Communist Party.
Well, the genocide in Xinjiang proves that point, and I think people that I talk to, experts on geopolitics, intelligence, would say, a lot of Western leaders say, well, the China of Xi Jinping is not the China that we thought we were engaging with in, the early 2000s or the 1990s. In fact, it was the same. China, you only had to read the 5-year plans going all the way back to see that there was no plan to sort of engage in some happy, movement towards democracy with the West. It was always that China was seeking to be hegemon, communist with Chinese state characteristics. But what has changed is that it seems that with this, new cult-like leader figure, Xi Jinping, for the past, since 2012, he has felt the confidence, or maybe even the personal need to advance China to its goals that it might have seen in 2100 or 2050, to reach them as fast as possible. Some would say even he has a lot of hidden hidden, opposition within China from tycoons or political rivals that believe that he's being too brazen and will trigger, has triggered such a strong reaction, bipartisan in the United States. So what has changed is that, yes, the level of brazenness and the openness about China's intentions are now clear for anyone to see and for Canadians to understand, with the two Michaels in jail and essentially in sort of torture conditions. But that was always the direction going back decades. It's just a lot easier to see now.
And I feel like we Canadians, we can be as outraged as we want to be, but the first step to any kind of intelligent recovery on some of these counts is to admit when you've been wrong or admit when you missed something, and it appears that we did so. We missed this. We should have done better. We should have known what was coming, and in a way, we have to do a mea culpa on our own first before throwing blame anywhere else, because we're still not admitting to ourselves and being honest even about our own leadership and their lack of leadership in this area. So if Canadians wanted to have a kind of come to reality moment and a moment of clarity here and be honest with themselves and say, you know what, we've made mistakes, we've gotten into bed, we've gotten into bed with the devil. We've shook hands with the devil and made a deal that we shouldn't have. How do we get out of this? What do you think that would look like in a popular sense? What would people on the ground floor be doing to try and eventually influence the people who make the decisions to make different decisions?
On a popular level, it would take, the grain lobby in Saskatchewan, or just the average farmer and his family up in Prince George, or people that realize that their standard of living in some ways, due to the policy decisions in Ottawa of the past decades, does rely on trade with China. But they would have to say, first of all, they would have to recognize that it hasn't gone the way that their leaders would have liked, and they would have to go to their leaders and say, you have to seek other trading relationships, and realize that will mean a straight up reduction like Australia has experienced, and maybe some pain. You might not even know how it turns out. The quality of life could perhaps even be better in terms of your local economies in some areas. But would there be a realization that China's plans for Canada mean that if you don't make that change and have that realization, literally in 10, 20 years, if China gets its way, they will have a lot of politicians at high levels in any political body in Canada. That's their goal. They don't want parliamentarians in Ottawa to stand up and vote that there was a genocide in Xinjiang, or to put the Olympics in doubt. They want politicians at all levels that are saying and singing China's line. So it would take the realization, first, we've discussed that it seems that the common voter is not happy with Canada's direction and engagement with China. They want some sort of change. They might have to realize that there'll have to be some belt tightening and some hard decisions, and they would have to tell their politicians, we realize that and we're ready for that. So that's sort of putting together, what those family dinner table conversations and understandings with the geopolitics that is out of, there's a misalignment we're talking about between what Canada's leaders are doing and how the average person feels about being bullied at all levels by China.
And indeed, all levels by China. It's interesting because, of course, there are, of course, sister cities at the municipal level. There are exchange students in our universities. Of course, there are exchange scientists, exchange faculty across the world. There are endowments that suddenly come into some research departments. There are provinces. The westernmost province and on the coast have the most direct relationship with China via the Pacific Ocean. But There are other ways that happens. And of course, you mentioned grain shipment, of course, all the way to Ottawa. And then finally, at the international level, there are indeed relationships with China, because either you're getting your money from China or you're getting it from America, and so you have to kind of line up on one side of the aisle or the other. And castigating the United States, whatever their faults, castigating the United States is very popular these days. One thing that's being mentioned, I actually have a comment stream here, Sam. So one of the things that's being mentioned here is the Belts to Roads program. So kind of the point being, of course, that there are, with all that money that China is harvesting from the West, they're using it to buy influence, not just in the West, but also into the third world. So classically, of course, if we think of the way that sort of the Western world was attempting to defeat communism and also keep its resource and logistical lines alive, it did investment in third world countries to try and make sure that whatever regime was there, usually not democratic, would be friendly to the West, and the exchange was that they would send various aid packages into that country and help keep that population better fed, better medicated. Obviously, China's following the same policy with more logistics, building roads in Africa, building, I think, even hydroelectric dams in various parts of the world. What does the West need to look out for there? If China has all this money, they can effectively start to invest in places around the world and really indeed buy their influence by pouring concrete.
Yeah, your viewers are very astute. The Belt and Road is obviously, as you framed it, it's sort of, again, this ironic reversal of British imperialism. China learned where they failed, and they're trying to swing it back to the other foot. They're aiming for, they've already captured a lot of the soft spots. These would be sort of third world countries with dictators that can so easily be corrupted with kickbacks and bribes on those major infrastructure projects. And I would swing it back to my book. One thing I talk about is how I had to make the mental leap. I eventually got to the place where I had evidence that the Chinese Communist Party was using its tycoons, it was using transnational gangs, it was using community leaders in foreign countries like Canada, all together in this big sort of business above ground and underground economy that involves money laundering. And the Belt and Road is right at the center of that plan. The U.S. State Department sees the Belt and Road as a massive vector of the highest level trade money laundering, espionage activity. That is, when you're pitching Belt and Road projects, of course, there's agents that are trying to corrupt the Western or already some of these third world dictators, gathering intelligence from them. So China likes to have a lot of lines of strategy going in any activity they're involved in, and the Belt and Road makes a perfect hub of economic infiltration. And I would say 2 points here. My story got into this whole China economic sort of espionage angle through casino money laundering. And one of the best cases involves a Macau casino tycoon who was indicted by the FBI for using 20 million or odd casino wire transfers from the East into the United States, but really using some of that money for bribing United Nations officials in New York. That case had so many elements that taught me a lot, including that Belt and Road type infrastructure projects and high-tech networks in Caribbean countries were all part of that scheme, where you have gangsters working with People's Liberation Army intelligence to sort of try to corrupt whatever the highest level is in the country that they're dealing with. And so let me finish by saying, what's the one big Belt and Road project approved in North America? You guessed it. It's in the Surrey area just outside Vancouver, a massive project that really got its birth when former Premier Christy Clark and her ministers were traveling over to Guangdong and Hong Kong and bargaining with Chinese Communist officials for a sort of Belt and Road trade deal. It eventually came to fruition under the NDP government to boot. So it just shows you that at a deep business level, BC is you could look at it if you're a positive business person, a leader in trade with China and North America, or if you're a security intelligence person, BC is the weak spot of infiltration through things like Belt and Road, casino money laundering, opioid overdose tragedies.
This litany that you're making there, it's just mind-boggling. I'm gonna use this moment again to plug your book for you. Again, I'm speaking with Sam Cooper, author of Wilful Blindness: How a Network of Narcos, Tycoons, and CCP Agents Infiltrated the West. That's the cover of it for those who are on viewership. For those who are listening, that was the title. So with the foreword by Charles Burton. I think that something that hits me here is that if this is so blatant, it's interesting because when I started asking you these questions, Sam, earlier, one of the first questions I asked you was, have you had to kind of look over your shoulder and whatever else? But the way that you're listing this, it kind of sounds like they're laughing at it. It's kind of like, oh, look, someone finally caught us, but it's too late now. Like, and they can kind of twirl their mustache and laugh maniacally. Do you think China's concerned at all that the West might change direction on this? Do you think that any of the Chinese leadership of the CCP party thinks that for a moment that the West is capable of reversing course on this, or do they think they already have it in hand?
It's a good question. I can say that before my book came out and in the weeks after, it appears, and I'm not the only one that thinks so, that sort of the A-team of influencers or pro-Beijing academics or media personalities or even politicians it almost seems that there was some level of realization that this book had some popular reach and was not dumbing things down, but telling things in an engaging way, trying to show, as I say, I knew what our intelligence and criminal intelligence has known for years in Canada. And I wanted to try to translate that for the Canadian public, and through my own journey of discovery, not being trained in intelligence or law enforcement, but being sort of a legally minded and curious history buff. I discovered this with my own eyes. I got the documents, and I do think I can say there are some people that believe that a sort of I write about a counterattack to my stories in the book, and there does seem to be messaging countering the book now. Does China think they already have it won in Canada? I can say this, that the frightening message for people listening today is that there are people in very credible sources say that if Canada were not part of if not for the Five Eyes, Canada would be fully compromised now by China. So we're talking about people that, very smart people, talking about concepts like state hollowing or state capture. And again, that might sound, out of left field, but certainly China wants vassal states and it wants to split up the Five Eyes. Previously, their focus had been New Zealand. You can read this in CSIS reports. New Zealand appeared to be the weakest link. But the people I talk to, these would be people in Australia, Canada, United States, are shaking their heads in the intelligence community that Canada does appear to be very weak. So it's an open question where to from now. This is sort of being come up in a lot of our back and forth here. What do Canada's leaders in Ottawa do now? Is the rot too deep? As someone that knows Vancouver, I can tell you a lot of people do look at some of, the economic infiltration, the opioid death totals, the money laundering, and say that this is a deep rot. Something big needs to change in Canada.
Something deep does need to change, and something big. But it's been a problem in Canada for generations at this point when it comes to a lack of vision for the country. Hopefully that's what changes. And in a sense, these desperate straits might be the thing that make it change. I'm 31. My generation cannot pay the difference in housing that was there. Between what boomers got to grow up with, even what Gen Xers got to scrape by with in some of the harder times, and even some of us early millennials that got into the market maybe before 08 if we were lucky enough. But but the rest of my generation and the generations after me are not going to be able to afford the lifestyle their parents had, and they're not going to take that lying down. I think that just repeats itself over and over again. As the cost of living goes up and the chance of living goes down, people are going to get quite frustrated. Hopefully that turns into the kind of political action that's constructive and reasserts Canadian sovereignty.
Well, I see this type of commentary across the interesting thing about social media is you get a sense of people's sort of political background or leanings. And I can honestly say that the real estate issue for millennials and the realization that surprise offshore wealth and criminality does have an impact in cities like Vancouver and Toronto. And this is a non-political, non-partisan issue for millennials, realizing that there's a lot to answer for from the older, especially, the decision makers in Ottawa, that not realizing what impacts turning a blind eye to this huge underground banking and dirty money would have on real estate prices. And I see people that are not fans of Aaron O'Toole or Doug Ford at the same time slamming the Trudeau government or Adam Vaughan and saying, what are you doing on this offshore wealth and what it's doing to my hopes of ever even buying a small condo in Toronto. So I think you're right that it's an issue where I've heard it from others that after reading my book or starting to follow my reporting, it's completely nonpartisan. The whole motivation was this realization that in many ways, the People's Republic of China, more specifically and correctly, the Chinese Communist Party, is the greatest threat to Canadian security and public safety. And that is a non-political issue. It's just a fact.
With that fact, just some thoughts on the book itself and kind of where you hope to go through from here. The book's been out now for how long, Sam?
We launched, I believe, around May 20th, so about a month. And honestly, I myself, let me just be honest and even a little self-serving. It took 3 years to write. I had known over a decade ago that I needed to write a book, and it was going in this direction. And I knew that I had captured a lot. I knew I'd put everything into it and perfected as much as I could. I was proud of what I handed in, and it has caught popular attention. It has reached, from 3 to even 1 in Amazon.ca sales charts, to the extent where the print product is pretty much sold out. They have to get the presses running again. So I've been blown away. 5-star reviews across the board. I'm humbled that let's be honest, the findings are controversial because they're new and they're advanced, but they're so well supported. I invite all rigorous reviews, but from everyone that's reading it, again, non-politically across the board, it's almost 100%, positive. So I just want to, keep going with this book. There could be other projects related to this specific book, and I hope to write books in the future. They may not all be on this thread, but I do think they'll be about sort of the interests of Canada and also understanding how underground economies affect everyday people, because I grew up, as I say in the book, sort of believing and understanding Canada was a country, an upright country of the rule of law, and I came to find that in many ways my education had let me down because there were sections of rot that had to be exposed.
No, absolutely. I mean, and indeed, that is the opening lines of our Constitution, isn't it? The supremacy of God and the rule of law. We hope to return to those vows, especially since that is the only way to make an equitable and just society for everyone here in Canada, which is what's promised when you come to the New World, and certainly what's promised when Canada puts its best foot forward. I want to say thank you so much for speaking to us today. If the printed copies are sold out, I guess people have to turn to the digital copy.
Right now, they can find the digital copies from Google, Amazon Kindle, Kobo. I do know that there are still printed copies in retail locations, and I'm pretty sure, You can get a copy if you wait long enough on services like Amazon. I've seen maybe a little bit of price inflation in some cases that I'm not happy about, but I do understand that the presses are going to be running soon. So if you can't get a handle on a print copy, I really hope you do for that summer read, but put a pre-order in. And the publisher is Optimum International. Send them an email or a note that you want to copy, and I'm sure the press will be running, and there'll be more coming out soon.
Thank you so much for giving us some of your time today. And again, I just really appreciate you being on the program, Sam.
Thanks. It's been a great conversation.
Absolutely. I hope to speak to you again soon, hopefully before the summer's over. We'll get an update from you on how things are going.
Sure. Thanks.
Thank you. Again, I was speaking with Sam Cooper, the author of Wilful Blindness, How a Network of Narcos, Tycoons, and CCP Agents Infiltrated the West. There is a picture of it right there. If you're on our viewership, if you are listening, it is a red cover with a map of the world and what looks like little, opiate, the Percocet sort of single line through a pill sort of thing. And, of course, the Chinese 5 stars on there as well. So that's by, I believe he said, Optimum Press. Just let me double check that one. Yep, Optimum Publishing International. And it's currently sold out. So that's for you there, Sue. You wanted to know what the book's name was, and there we are. So that was a lot, I think. It was good. It was really good. I'm not disagreeing with any of it. It's an incredibly harrowing kind of discussion, though, because essentially he's a reporter, he's an investigative journalist, and he's going to stick with the facts, right? And you got to be careful about interpreting motive. I'm a pundit, so that's all I do is interpret motive or impute motive. That's what I do. I mean, there are moments where I can kind of try and give somebody the benefit of the doubt, but I mean, that's not. Nobody wants that. I mean, I guess it's good TV, right, for me to kind of impute motive on everybody and read into things in a ridiculous way. But let's be clear here. I don't think it's a ridiculous thing to say that the Chinese Communist Party is clearly hell-bent on world domination, and in a way that, quite frankly, is brutally inhuman, even by their standards, even by the standards of tyranny that occurred in the 20th century. It's incredible, really, because, I mean, what we went over through the course of that discussion was no less than, let's see, we talked about the slave camps a little bit. We didn't talk about them a ton, but we did talk about what's going on in Xinjiang and the Uyghur genocide and the slave camps and the organ harvesting that's happening, because, of course, that's both the Uyghur Muslims and the Falun Gong. In fact, they really like harvesting organs from Falun Gong because the Falun Gong have very strict dietary observations, so they're usually very healthy people, so they make for great organ harvesting. I know that sounds maybe very terrible, and not even a sarcastic comment on that still sounds far too dark, but that's the truth of the matter. The truth of the matter is that the Chinese Communist Party and their tyranny in their own continent, let alone around the rest of the world, is indeed harvesting people's organs and using them in a cash for organ system where you can book an appointment and quickly get an organ in and installed in you that's been failing on you. So there's that aspect. There's also, of course, the aspect of what's going on in Hong Kong. Hong Kong, a formerly democratic place ruled by the British up until, I believe, the handover was in 95, 97, sometime in the 90s. And, of course, the promise was that Hong Kong would always remain basically in its kind of now cultural persuasion after being under British rule for a century, which was a semi-parliamentary system for Hong Kong, certainly a democratic system. And yes, it was just one little island, and it was a large population base, obviously, on that little island, but it was one little place, and it was supposed that, even the Chinese Communist Party could endure Hong Kong, given how much money it made them too, because Hong Kong was still a hub of trade and still is today, and is a very important part of the Chinese economic system. So you'd think that they would have paid their piper and called the tune, but no, that wasn't enough for China. And now, of course, subjugation of Hong Kong and turning it into just another part of the rest of China, extinguishing any of freedom's light in Hong Kong. That was their mission, the mainland Chinese Party's mission, Chinese Communist Party's mission, and they did so. They have, it's, as far as I know, Hong Kong is essentially under an iron fist. It hasn't changed since the beginning of the pandemic, which is when suddenly the virus appeared. And so I think a lot of this is all tied together. And then finally, of course, we get into what Sam was talking about specifically with reference to the actual money laundering and everything else that goes on. So China, again, I want to take this from the top a little bit. Actually, we have some comments here that's interesting. Sheldon, there's Sheldon Jones. Their wish for domination has never changed. I'm gobsmacked on governments. I believe that they would not leverage themselves. No, I completely agree. I completely agree. But let's go back over a kind of historical sort of analysis of what's going on here. So once upon a time, there was this thing called the Orient, right? And we need to remember that up until only 500 years ago or so, you couldn't get things from the Orient without walking there or having it being walked to you. So that made it really expensive. And we have to remember that all the way back to the Crusades, right? That's when the Western world, that is to say Europe and Christendom, some Eastern Orthodoxy as well through Russia and through Greece and through Constantinople, but a great deal of it into the West. When the Crusades happen, all of a sudden the Crusaders march all the way to the Holy Land. And when they get to the Holy Land, they're experiencing things they've never experienced before. And of course, the way that we always round that up is to just say spices. But whether we're talking about the silks that were coming from the East and all the particular things that were happening in the Middle East that were different from the West, the diversity of food, the diversity of garments, and kind of the wealth. Because if you live in a naturally hot place, you get to kind of use your leisure a little bit easier. And so the leisure of the Middle East, or at least of their courtiers, were developing these things, made all the wealth of the West look rather paltry. So the Crusaders got a hunger for this. Obviously, they kept going back on crusade to kind of gather more treasures and whatever else they could get a hold of. It didn't go on. Obviously, the Holy Land went back to being under eventually Turkish rule, which of course the Turks are a mix between the Mongolian sweep that happened out of Mongolia, where they took over about 3/4 of the known planet's surface at that point, and the known world surface, the old world. And they eventually, as they mix with different cultures, they eventually developed different cultures. Part of what's in India today is descended from the Mongolian sweep. Same with parts of China, throughout much of Central Asia, especially, and then of course into the Middle East. And so, especially Turkey. Of course, the Turks are not Arabs, right? The Turks are a different ethnicity. And so eventually the Turks take over Asia Minor, which used to be Byzantium, and then of course they take over Constantinople because they build gigantic cannons that are able to actually puncture the wall, and they break through the wall, and they eventually take Constantinople, which in 1453 is the last living part of the old Roman Empire. So in one way or another, it's arguable that the Roman Empire, in its various, well, the Roman legacy and the classical ancient world lived for almost 2,000 years on planet Earth, from somewhere around 500 BC all the way to about just before 1500. 1450 CE. So, in the Christian era. So the point is that that's what the world is up until basically, Europe before 1500, right? So that's the world before 1500. You can't get to India or China by sea because nobody knows how to do it. Nobody builds ships that are big enough. And then the land route gets cut off after Constantinople is conquered. So now you get the age of exploration, right? And so science breaks off, and modernity happens, the Reformation happens, and ethics and what you ought to do and what you can do are completely decoupled, thanks to Machiavelli, thanks to Francis Bacon, etc., etc., etc. And finally, you have, of course, the age of exploration. So Holland, Portugal, Spain, and England, as well as France, of course, because we call Quebec New France for a reason, they all begin to send out ships and explorers and start to plant flags all over the New World, all over Africa, and eventually they get around Africa to India, and eventually they get around India and all the way to China. And so now you have sea routes to China and the Orient. You have sea routes into the West Indies, into the East Indies. You have sea routes all the way to Australia. Eventually people discover where Australia is. I wonder what the person who discovered Australia thought later when I don't know if he figured it out, but you have to think, they didn't know they had stumbled into a continent. Everything else in Oceania isn't like that, right? It's just tiny little islands. And then you stumble across a continent-sized thing, and you're like, well, I mean, I've got this island. I'm planting this flag here, but I wonder how big this thing is. And later you find out that you discovered something, the size of Brazil. It's pretty amazing. But the point is that after the age of exploration, we have this moment where the British want to break into China. And as I said in my opening statement, we need to understand that China always took the cash and sold items, and they never wanted to pay back. There was never any method of exchange. They preferred to just store up cash. They didn't want, and this was actually a problem for Rome and for other civilizations that ever traded with China, because the problem was they could actually have to get into an inflationary state with their money because they didn't have enough gold. Because they would send China gold, and then they'd be like, well, do you have anything that we have that we can exchange for our gold back? Like, that's how the economy works, right? You sell an item for a medium of exchange, which is money, and the medium of exchange is always worth more than the item you paid for, because the medium of exchange can be used for anything, right? I can use $1,000 to help pay for a sawmill. I can use $1,000 to buy jubes, but I can't use jubes to buy sawmills. So the point is that, or unless that person makes a very specific deal, but money's worth more because they could use the money I gave them to go buy fuel or to go on a trip or to just throw it in their bank account. You can't put jubes in a bank account. The point is that the gold that was being exchanged for Rome, eventually Rome was running out of gold as they kept shipping it to China. And the same with every other empire and civilization that ever dealt with China and the Orient. You kept sending them your money, and they sent you the items you were paying for back, but they never sent any money back to pay for items from you. And so you got into this very asymmetrical situation where you're running out of gold. You have to keep mining gold to pay for things that you want from China, but you can't ever get China to buy things from you for the most part. So the problem is that the British come around the bend here. They've basically taken over India, or most of the way of India. We have to remember, actually, the first people who got into India were the Portuguese. That's why there's in southern India there's actually a huge Catholic population. But the point is that they get around the subcontinent. They zip around Indochina, as it would later be called, French Indochina. Now called Vietnam, Laos, and everything else. Sheldon's like, jubes. Everybody loves jubes. Yes, we do. I was grasping for an analogy there. So we had jubes were what was on the menu. And the point is that we get to China, and now the British Empire is there, and they want to trade with China. But the problem with China is that, once again, they'll sell you all the tea in the world, but they won't sell back. They won't give you back money and buy things from you. So Britain had textiles to sell China, but why would they buy them? They have a 5,000-year-old civilization that knows how to make clothes. They don't need textiles from Britain, which at that time it's kind of a reverse of today's situation. All of our stuff's made in China. We have to remember, at one point, everything was made in the developed world. The developed world was where your clothes were made and all manufactured goods were made. And so at this point, it's the British who have all the textiles, all the clothes. Instead of saying made in Bangladesh, it says made in Britain, made in Scotland usually. Not that they labeled it that way. But the point is that they want China to trade with them. And we have to remember, trade involves both money and goods and services. You can't just give away money and get goods and services. You're eventually going to run out of money, right? And that's actually called, Brian's got a point here. It's called insularity. I think it's also called mercantilism. We all remember being told about mercantilism when we were in, I don't know, it's grade 8 or 9, that social studies lesson is in. But the point is this: China didn't want to play ball on this because they didn't need anything. They were a self-sufficient civilization that was happy to take people's cash and didn't need to worry about buying items from their countries. So Britain broke into China and essentially broke the will of the Chinese people to a point, certainly made a dent into their political machinations, because they began to ship opium from what would have been, of course, parts of Afghanistan. Afghanistan still figures very largely into opium today, but especially India and the poppy fields of Pakistan. And so they would make the opium, and they would ship it, smuggle it into China, and then the Chinese population would become very addicted to opium, and there were a lot of problems. Opium dens were a crime in many respects. They were, well, I mean, they are a crime. It's terrible to enslave people to any kind of substance. But the British had done this, and so they essentially broke the political wall, broke down the great sea wall of China, the wall against having, and the will against having any kind of British manufactured goods sold to them, and just taking British money. Eventually, the colonial powers got their way, and China had to open up for business. Not much different than the gunboat diplomacy that took place between America and Japan at the end of the 19th century, where, of course, Americans showed up with their gunboats on the very insular shores of Japan and essentially said, "You're trading with us, and that's final." And the Japanese said, "I guess so, yes." So we have to remember that it's not as if there isn't any historical context to this. And it is not as if one day somebody sitting around at a brainstorming table in the Chinese Communist Party, a bunch of freshman students or a bunch of sophomores who are interns of the Communist Party, who are all sent into a room with a whiteboard and told to come up with like the 10 ways to defeat the West, suddenly came up with this idea. There's a historical background to the selling of drugs into a country in order to break its political solidarity and to create division. So that has a place to begin. And what happened from there, of course, is all history now. So the Chinese have learned their lesson, which is that if you use narcotics and other substances to infiltrate, to addict another person's population, you can get really far with that little trick. And then the next thing that you can do is, of course, influence their political regime by buying them off, which is another thing that the colonial powers did do to China and to other places, right? This is not new. We have to be honest about colonialism and imperialism. There was a time where, every developed European nation had its influence around the world. And they did it through military might and through superior manufacturing, textiles, consumer goods, and of course, finally, money, buying influence, and of course, cajoling people into their will. That's not news. That happened. That's an objective fact. And kind of to take a brief pause here for a second, that's something we have to be honest about when we get into this question of the whole cancellation of Canada Day or some of the complaints of the left around Canada's founding and everything else. I think that Canada is a fundamentally moral concept, and I think that it was a moral founding, and it's a moral idea of a country. It needs some work. It had some failings. It's had leaders in it that have been less than perfect. But the fundamental idea of Canada is a good one. And wherever we sit on the sovereignty question, we must be honest with ourselves that we're at least trying to rescue the good parts of Canada. We're not just trying to throw away the bad parts or the political parts that cause me pain and force me to, deal with assessment authorities and federal agents crawling all over the place and fish cops and God knows what else. So here's the point. Bad things did happen under colonialism. We have to be honest about that. But simultaneously, continuing those bad things is not virtuous. And that would be my response to anybody from the Communist Party of China. I would say, look, I understand that bad things happened and those things should not have happened. But the answer to that, just like burning those churches in southern BC, is not the answer to what happened in the residential school. The answer from the Chinese Communist Party to essentially turn the screws on the West and get them addicted to drugs and watch them, flop around like marionettes, I think that is not the answer. And I think it's deeply immoral, especially considering how we know that went for their population. And ultimately, there isn't a need for domination in order to have a place at the table when it comes to world affairs. Finally, I'd argue too that unlike the Western world, the the Chinese population, it is quite restive. There's lots of riots and stuff inside of China for different issues. Those things happen. They have to suppress them. If you didn't have a population to suppress, you wouldn't be suppressing it. So there must be something to the whole problem of needing to have so much police and needing to have so much coercion. That China's population is actually quite restive under some of the restrictions. They're not happy with the way that they're being ruled, and people need to think about that. But the point that I'm trying to draw here simply is that the legacy of Sino, non-Sino relations, right? So Sino-British, Sino-French, Sino-German, it doesn't matter. So the point is that all Chinese and non-Chinese relationships, historically, especially over the last couple hundred years, they've been rocky, to put it politely. Very, very rocky. Very, very hard to understand. And difficult and complicated, and quite frankly, with no small amount of bloodshed. So that's not news. Right? That's not news. We understand that. The news part is that it isn't just a bunch of people uncoordinate, without coordination in China or around the world with Chinese loyalty, making decisions that simultaneously somehow accidentally all fit together. It appears to be, as far as Sam is saying, a cooperative strategy and willful blindness on the part of our leaders here in the West. Again, I was speaking to Sam Cooper earlier, the author of Wilful Blindness, which discusses how a network of narcos, tycoons, and CCP agents infiltrated the West and began influencing us. Apparently, the book has sold out. Do look for it online, though apparently it's going to be about as inflated as some of the housing prices we have in Canada. So wait for the next printing. Pre-order a copy and wait for the next printing, because it's already sold out. People were very excited to read an in-depth, investigative, hard-hitting journalism piece on the question of Chinese influence throughout Canada, the West, and the United States, and probably even some parts there in the American election. That's all brilliant. And of course the pandemic. So let's turn now to that question, the pandemic. So speaking with Mr. Cooper just a few minutes ago, one of the things that got brought up was the issue of the pandemic. And the pandemic is no one's cup of tea. Some people prefer scamdemic, some people prefer plandemic. I will simply say that the crisis, the self-inflicted crisis that we've been in for 18 months, almost exactly. Actually, it'll be 18 months, I guess, basically, when me and my beloved get married, because that'll be the end of August, and really it was somewhere around February for most people that they felt that whatever the lockdowns began. The point is that we're still in the middle of this thing, even as things begin to loosen up and free up and change, and some sanity seems to be restored. The issue is that when we were talking with Sam, he made the point that no, absolutely he believed that regardless of motive around the virus itself, it was clear that the Chinese Communist Party was not telling the truth about what had happened in Wuhan. They had locked down Wuhan. They did not inform the world about what was really going on. They locked down Wuhan for their own travel within China, but they allowed Wuhan to continue to ship people all over the world. So people who were exposed to whatever happened in Wuhan were able to travel around the world without the Chinese government's knowledge, without any kind of filtration or warning, and the virus and, of course, the panic began to spread. So that was a geopolitical move, as far as our resident expert Sam Cooper is concerned. His point of view is that while again we can't impute motive, we can look at facts, and the facts and the evidence declare in no uncertain terms that at some point it was understood that the virus was spreading, and it was not stopped from spreading outside of China. It was only stopped from spreading within China. So we've lived through Sheldon Jones again likes this way of saying that self-inflicted crisis. I'm going to use that. No, that's precisely it. It is a self-inflicted crisis, and we're paying the price for it now, with our inflation, with our panic, with our mistrust in government, with our experts that we're getting paid to get things wrong. At this point, if you were trying to stage some kind of coup inside of Canada or whatever, or if you had somehow seized the government inside of Canada, the first thing you'd have to do is make a public example of all the health officers in order to establish your legitimacy. Let's put it that way. That's the only way I'm going to put it. I am not encouraging violence at all. I am simply saying that the fact of the matter is that these people are so loathed by a wide swath of the population, regardless of their stance on the vaccine or the virus. They themselves are so loathed that honestly you would have to have some kind of public humiliation in order to legitimize your own authority. And indeed, if those people are still in those positions in a democratic sense, and when the next elections come along, I think that those governments will lose. They'll have to make an example of them. So they're just using them right now. But those health officers, if I was the health officer of any of these places, including the nation, I'd be counting my days. I'd have saved up some cash, and I would all but leave the country. Maybe I would leave the country, or I'd put myself up in Nunavut or something. I would not stay anywhere near the press or a populous area, because the fact of the matter is that, you know, if I was in a health officer, I'd have to admit that I got paid to be wrong while other people died, and other people lost their jobs, and then died from losing their jobs because a lot of people committed suicide. And so I think that the short version is, don't be paid to be wrong. Because people don't forget that. So, free piece of advice to all of our health officers. People's rage, I don't think, is going to abate even after this pandemic's over. The self-inflicted wound. Where were we? We were talking about the question of China and their influence when it comes to the pandemic. The pandemic and what happened out of Wuhan and all this jazz is that ultimately China capitalized in a way that the West couldn't, because they had information the West didn't have. And so the issue becomes that the Chinese Communist Party doubled down on their subjugation of various populations while the rest of the world was distracted by the Wuhan flu that was zipping around. And finally, I think that I have no doubt that the Chinese Communist Party helped influence the election against Donald Trump. Yeah, no question. The former President Donald Trump, and definitely, if some of that money laundering and everything else that Sam was mentioning is so easily to do in Vancouver, you can't imagine how easy it is to do in the rest of the world. It makes sense that a lot of that money was spent on trying to get Mr. Biden elected, and some of his friends, and so that doesn't surprise me at all. And wherever Biden's tact is with China, I think it is probably tougher than it would have been in the 90s. But nonetheless, it's not the China rhetoric that and the China blaming and focus that was going on from former President Trump. And so I think they're happy that he's out of office. They're happy that he's at the Winter White House in Mar-a-Lago, and he's not in charge anymore. So I think that was a really informative discussion with Sam, and we learned a lot. And so ultimately, we look at kind of the world around us and how it might be changed. And what I think is actually here's a hot take. One of the things I think that's going to make a very interesting discussion at some point about the way China was treating people versus the tyrants of the 20th century is that the Chinese culture is not a Western culture, which I guess is me kind of dog whistling that it's not a Christian culture either. That being said, of course, you can counter with the fact that obviously Stalin and Hitler and the gang throughout Europe were all pretty brutal, and that was wrong. And obviously that was a Western culture, and therefore by definition a Christian culture. So what's your point? And that's a fair question. I guess ultimately, maybe there were at least two limiting factors when it came to tyranny in the 20th century. One of the limiting factors was the sheer fact that there just wasn't the overproduction that we have today. Even after the Industrial Revolution, even right into the Second World War, we just didn't have the redundancy we have today, and we didn't have the advanced reaches of government we have today. Spy networks were still spy networks. Like, a human being had to go observe something, take some pictures, and then die on his way to handing them to his handler, or be killed shortly afterwards. Like, there's a reason we had Cold War movies. Like, all these movies, all these films about the Second World War, right after the Second World War, and all the moves that are being made, and all the chicanery going on. That is all from a human element. So if you have drones that can do the observation, and you have smart TVs that listen to you, and you have never forget, right? If you're going to have a sensitive conversation, always remember to put your phone into an RFID bag, right? And make sure that the bag is sealed, and it's, basically tinfoil. You can also put it inside of a microwave if you have to. Wrap it up in tinfoil, put it inside of a microwave if you need to have a super sensitive conversation that you do not want anybody to be able to listen to. So that's always a good point. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that the 20th century, one of the limiting factors of it was just, quite frankly, you really could still starve to death. And you could, there just wasn't, and you could, go naked for that matter. There just wasn't the redundancy that we have today, and the technology that accompanies that redundancy of, phones that can listen to you, TVs that can listen to you, remote controls that can listen to you. I think you can talk to your fridge now. So that power of the state to observe you just wasn't quite there. And the other part of it was that maybe the simpler part of it is that Western culture, as much as it's ever been manipulated into its tyrannical forms, and make no mistake, it has, it that is always a corruption of its fundamental elements, because it, by its very elements, it's just, it doesn't believe that man is inherently stratified, or inherently unequal, or inherently undignified. And it doesn't have racial superiority as its basis. If you look at Greco-Roman, Judeo-Christian, Anglo, and if you want to use Anglo-Saxon or Anglo-European or Western European elements of an ideas, the inherent ideas in them are not stratification-based, caste-based, unequal-based. This was actually always one of the differences between East and West. And so one of the great dangers in my mind, to be honest with you, is that when you look at what might happen when it comes to Chinese domination, is that, quite frankly, Confucian culture doesn't have those same humanistic elements in it. It just doesn't. And so, say what you will about the 20th century and the evils thereof, and they are inexcusable, and they must never be forgotten. And we must always recall what happened at Auschwitz, what happened in the Gulag, what happened in certain parts of Spain during the Civil War, and the brutality of all these things is absolutely wicked and brutal and awful. And the total war methods that were used are still inexcusable, and the terrible things that happen to domestic populations, unarmed domestic populations. But nonetheless, none of us in the West argue for a second that was somehow inherent to Western ideas. Maybe unhinged, some of us arguing all the way from basically the Reformation onwards, that the West has been kind of unhinged. But nonetheless, the point is that ultimately nobody in the West, no matter how reactionary, would argue that our philosophy at its foundation is fundamentally inhuman and intolerant. Indeed, it has a self-correcting methodology in it, going both secular and sacred, religiously and philosophically, politically. That there should always be this reflecting back, these thoughts over our actions, and then how we might do better, again, both in our secular and sacred realms. That is not the case when it comes to Confucian culture. It's not the case when it comes to much of the Orient. And we need to be very careful about this, because that cultural difference, I think, is where some of those points are exacerbated. I'm not excited for a fundamentally non-Western civilization as the hegemon of the world, because their understanding of things, even in its subtleties and its nuance, is never going to be our understanding, and it's going to influence us in a very, very dangerous way. And so coming back to the points of what Sam was making when it came to their money laundering and their influence buying, I've heard stories actually of politicians. If you go to China, you need to keep yourself on lockdown basically when you go to China, because one way or another, politicians and leaders that are taken to China are eventually shown the dancing girls or the dancing boys, whichever they prefer, and pictures are taken of them with their newfound friends in their tryst, to put it as politely as possible. And so I've heard that from many different sources that, quite frankly, our leaders need to be on the guard all the time. They should probably always bring their wives or their spouses. I mean, obviously, there's female leaders as well. They should always bring their spouses and basically not leave the hotel. And even then, the hotel's bugged. I personally, if I was a leader, I would never go to China. You don't go to certain kind of burlesque shows and bars trying to be an upstanding part of your church community. The same thing happens when it comes to going to China. As far as I'm concerned, with being a leader, I would just simply refuse to go. We can meet in Japan. I wouldn't encourage anyone to go to China. In fact, I think going to China is a really bad idea, regardless of who you are. And I'm very sorry for the two Michaels that are currently hostage there. And I think that's a shame. It's a deep mark of shame upon all of us in Canada, particularly our leaders, that are refusing to do anything to help that man. That's inexcusable. But I think kind of coming back to what Sam was talking about, and again, indeed looking at that from a kind of bird's eye view and a grand overarching strategy view, the issue becomes very quickly, how do you counter it? Because basically what's happening with China is that they're exploiting, that is to say the Communist Party in China is exploiting our free access, our open doors, our democratic system to make us more like them or to bring us under their thumb. Whereas we have no way of influencing them back because, quite frankly, the Chinese system is so insular. Actually, while I'm here, maybe I'll brainstorm a little bit, and maybe people have some comments about how they might influence China differently. It was said really well once, and I'm going to put up my email here just so people have it. If people have some suggestions or they'd like to say something. And then Sue's got something to say here. Sue McGillivray, thank you, but I've done a lot of research on Canada, but things are much deeper than the CCP. Our system is very dirty, the whole system. I don't doubt that for a second. The Canadian political system is deeply corrupt. And the problem is that they are just getting paid from something else. And unfortunately, none of them are getting paid even by their cousin to keep the shipyard open. A lot of them are getting bought off by foreign money. American, Chinese, and elsewhere. And so that's very dangerous. But let's take a step back and go, how would you, if you had to influence China, how would you do it? I basically would do it this way. These are my suggestions. So engaging with China militarily is impossible because China has nuclear weapons and because China has, while they have a pathetic excuse for a navy, as far as I remember, They like to have a lot of bluster. That's one thing I will say about the Chinese bluster. A lot of it is bluster, and a lot of it is cheap crap, and it's big talk. And they have a lot of influence here, there, and everywhere, I guess, but it's all cheap because it's all money. It's not loyalty, right? They've bought all their influence. And that's the thing about buying your influence. As soon as you stop buying the drinks for everybody at the bar, suddenly everybody forgets who you are. Whereas, the old guy in the back who's been coming to this bar for 20 years, everybody kind of knows who that guy is, and they've gone to him for relationship advice, or they've gone to him to tell him that they're having a baby or whatever. And so there's two different worlds, right? You can be the new kid on the block who's buying everybody drinks, or you can be the old regular at the back of the bar who's still, you basically own this place. This is your joint. This is your town. And no new money is going to be pushing you out of your spot. So let's take a step back here. How would we influence China? What would we do? I think the first thing to do actually would be to effectively keep Christianizing China. So I would say that I know for a fact there's a huge underground religious movement inside of China because the Chinese Communist Party is very anti-religion, regardless of what that religion is. I mean, they kind of like Confucianism because it's about conformity, but that's it. They don't even like it that much. And a lot of those temples got torn down when Mao was in charge. So the Chinese Communist Party is very anti-religion. So the single greatest thing you can do to your enemy is at least annoy them to death, right? And by influencing more religious growth in China, you are forcing the Chinese Communist Party to come face to face with the most dangerous thing that they know on the planet, which is the irreducibility of loyalty to God, and to the spiritual realm. And so I think that's one way to influence China for the better, for the long term, would be to evangelize China, send as many missionaries in there as possible, and to try and essentially Christianize China from the ground up, which is no different than what happened to Rome, and no different what happened to the pagan cultures that were missionized after, and no different to even missionary journeys today. You can try and win over, the president or the El Presidente for life of a country, or the king of a country. But it might be better to just go after his subjects, and to try and make them, understand that they're made in the image of God. God loves them. And if they're made in the image of God and God loves them, then why are they either acting in a way that's beneath their own dignity, or living in a civilization that's beneath their dignity, so they could work to change it? So that would be, I think, the first, and the most dependable method would be to evangelize China. And so for all those people who are currently evangelizing China, I've known a couple of them, I met a couple of them over the years. Thank you for your service. I do hope that you have the courage to go back. And for those who are already in China, do try to continue your work. We'll be praying for you. So the second method that I would use to influence China, though, would be in the secular realm. And in the secular realm, what I would want to do is send people into, one way or another, kind of infiltrate their workforces, and have their workforces agitate for better wages and a better living, and a better lifestyle, and a cleaner world, cleaner environment. Not talking about environmentalism purely, but talking about just the fact that like cities in China can be quite dirty because they're still running on coal, and health problems in China can be quite severe. There's a lot of stratification in China. There's a lot, there's this oligarchs at the top, and there can still be very poor people on the bottom. That's how I would change China, is that I would send in people, basically union representatives and that sort of thing, to influence, especially their sweatshops and their slave labor, to influence the places. I mean, the only reason that you can afford this device, right, is because lots of its pieces were made in China, and with labor that is underpaid, and so that's another way to influence it. So if we go in there and we teach people basically that they have a transcendent value. It's funny. Rose West said, "Death via unions." Yeah, I mean, this is actually a funny. I'll do this funny aside. I have to get going pretty quick here because the pipeline's coming soon, but. I'm being contacted by various people. I'm sorry. We're all in the middle of these silly wedding planning things. Every now and again, I have to check in on them. But let's pivot back to what's going on here. So it was funny. I was in this BC political panel thing, which actually, unfortunately, just got canceled. Good friend Stuart Parker, he's part of the show all the time. You see him on Thursdays. He'll be here tomorrow. But he unfortunately just couldn't do the political panel thing anymore. And that's too bad. We'll talk to him about it tomorrow. But that was a great time while we were there. And it was ironic because basically it was a bunch of progressives, even the person who was from the right of center party, the BC Liberal Party. And he and everybody else were basically just a bunch of progressives, liberals. I wouldn't call them necessarily leftists, but just progressives, right? They think that everything's going to get better and everything's going to be fine. But we were talking about trying to influence China or whatever, and I brought up the whole point of trying to get their labor organized to make them pricier, to make them expensive, right? So because that's the thing, organized labor is expensive, and that's why people avoid it, right? Unions make labor expensive, but they also, simultaneously, when your labor is expensive, and there's no other options, you get paid a good wage, and you're actually able to raise your family and provide for them. So that's the thing we always have to remember about labor markets. But the issue is, it was funny because I'm sitting there in a room full of progressives debating the issues of China. And essentially the argument that I'm making is the old communist argument, which is that if we just get the workers to be organized, we can overthrow the tyrants and have the revolution. And it's just kind of irony of ironies, right? Like I mean, I'm about as reactionary as it gets on a lot of counts. And I mean, the other day we had Aaron on here, and he had the point that somebody called you a socialist on the Western Standard. So I had to come on to tell them what a real socialist was. I couldn't have people thinking you were a socialist, and the whole socialist movement would be destroyed. So I'm no one's idea of a socialist, but the joke was I was the one making the old communist argument of we will organize the workers, and the workers will overthrow the tyrants and the petty bourgeoisie and the oligarchs, and everybody was just looking at me like I was insane. And they're all like, you can't do that. You can't organize the workers. The workers will never organize. So they're all descended from Marxian ideas for the most part, and then one kind of classical liberal. And then there's me over here, who's a conservative, who would rather have there be like all but no state and a bunch of night watchmen and church on Sunday, and people just and for some reason I'm the one making the manifesto argument, and everybody else is like, that's insane. Yeah, Sheldon thought that was really funny. Yeah, no, I know, it's hilarious. But I think, if I'm being perfectly honest, I think that's actually the only way forward. I think we have to Christianize China, and we have to organize its labor so that it's not slavery anymore. That, and probably somehow infiltrate their slave camps, and particularly their prison camps, especially where the organs are being harvested and that sort of thing, and try and expose that even more and be clear about what's going on there. And that might cost some of our lives. I mean, that's not going to be easy. I think I'll leave this example with you. Way back when the New World was first being colonized, I believe there was a Capuchin, that or a Carmelite, can't remember, but there was a religious order. That wanted to minister to the slaves in the West Indies, and of course at this time there was slavery, and that was run by the Spanish Empire. And in order to minister to the slaves in the West Indies, they themselves had to sell themselves into slavery. And so I don't know if there is a greater act of solidarity than that. He who would lay down his life for his friends, right, is what it says in John. And I think that's kind of the attitude we have to take on this in a lot of counts. Like, we have to be in solidarity. And until we're in solidarity with the underclass of China, I don't think we'll be able to change China. There's a great irony, of course, is that by persecuting our underclass and by making them addicted to opiates and making it impossible for them to ever own a home or barely live in a home, the cost of rent even. There are people who are living in tents who aren't homeless. They are choosing to not pay rent because of the egregious expense that is rent. So need to keep that in mind. Maybe they now legalized smoke marijuana, but in general, there are people who literally live on the lam, right? Live in their vehicles, live in tents, live just off the road in the bush or whatever, because of the cost of civilization. And the Chinese are influencing that. That is to say, the Chinese Communist Party are influencing that. So I would argue that until we understand that they are using our underclass to kind of destroy us, turning our least of these against their own civilization and destroying them, literally murdering them with lethal doses of fentanyl, then maybe the only way, in a sense, is to kind of love their underclass back, right? If you turn back good for ill, right? And to show them that there is a different way forward, and we don't have to do this. We don't have to play this domination game, and because domination is eventually going to lead to violence, and violence after the development of the atomic bomb, that's going to be a very short-lived but long-lasting impression, and that's going to be a problem. So I'm not interested in another nuclear war, but I think that we need to be clear about that. Well, another nuclear war. I just mean that the end of the Second World War ended with a nuclear weapon. And I think that's two of them, actually, of course. I think that's kind of where I would leave that comment and leave those ideas. We must do something about this problem from the Chinese Communist Party. We must do something about our lack of leadership. We must do something about the capture of our leadership and the lack of intelligence and the lack of integrity in our leadership. And we must do something to secure our borders, secure our economy, secure our home front. But if we want to make a lasting difference, we will need to go into the belly of the beast and make a difference for the people of China. Because in the end, if we're all human beings, we all value human life, we should hope that everyone, again, by living properly moral and ethical lives, and free lives lived in freedom, have the best life possible. And there's only one way to do that. The wealth of the West, the legacy of the West, the heritage of the West, the liberty of the West comes from one place. And that is its heritage as a freeborn people, born of those ethics that come from Western values, the Greco-Roman understanding, the Western European understanding, and of course, the Judeo-Christian understanding, which all comes together in our freedom-loving civilization that asks us to act upon our conscience and asks us to stand up against injustice. So hopefully we can teach that to others around the world. That was a bit of a long-winded preaching at the end there, but hopefully you enjoyed it. I am going to bring up our end of the show stuff here, and I'm so thankful for you watching today. Do let us know what else you'd like to see on the show. Send us your comments and your concerns and your questions. And thank you so much for tuning into Mountain Standard Time. We'll see you again tomorrow, 9 a.m. Pacific, 10 a.m. Mountain.